Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first virtual Sounds Smart event. I'm Georgie Holt, the new UK MD of Acast, and this is my second week in the business. Working at home during a global pandemic was, to say the least, an unexpected way to start the role. But I firmly believe, as I'm sure many of you out there do too, that this will be a time for many great lessons to be learned for all of us. We must all find a way to create as much positive emotion as we can, building more resilience, more innovation, and more creativity as we go. It was an easy decision to join Acast. It works with some of the best names in podcasting worldwide, from the likes of Off Menu, the Adam Buxton podcast, Table Manners with Jessie Ware, My Dad Wrote a Porno, and Feel Better, Live More with Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. Not to mention it's home to shows from the BBC, the Financial Times, Vice, and many more publishers. Acast is absolutely the global home of podcasting. During a rapidly changing time for all of us, Acast's continued energy and enthusiasm for podcasting, combined with its unrelenting commitment to bringing the most innovative opportunities to advertisers and creators, means podcasting is thriving. Despite the situation we find ourselves in, creators are still putting out regular episodes for audiences, and they are more engaged than ever. We've hit record listens across the Acast network, both globally and in the UK. And with more people listening to shows whilst they stay at home, smart brands are investing in podcasting to reach immersed audiences at a larger scale than ever before. So thank you so much for joining us today. We would usually hold these events in person, and we're planning to bring them to Manchester and London, but these will now be pushed back to later in the year. However, we still wanted to update you all during this time on all of the exciting and latest Acast news and what podcasting has to offer. Today, you're going to be hearing from Acast in-house podcasting experts, Josh Woodhouse, Jack Preston, Leo Goldingham, and Christiana Brenton. And we are so delighted to have Dr. Rangan Chatterjee joining us today in conversation with our Global Vice President of Brand, Lizzie Pollitt. Before we begin, don't forget to have your headphones on or nearby, as we'll be showing some innovations in audio later in the session. So that's all from me for now. Over to Josh Woodhouse, UK Director of Sales, who'll be talking through Acast Intelligence. Josh.
Thank you very much, Georgie. And thanks to all of you for joining us as we begin this webinar by looking at some of the data-led trends that we have identified during the pandemic. Now, in a time of economic uncertainty and industrial unrest, there has never been such a need for accountable, honest, and market-defining insight. To date, we at Acast have delivered this in the form of weekly infographics that highlight both the listening and content trends that we've seen. However, today, we will be diving even deeper and bringing you an insight into the current state of the podcast market here in the UK, along with the undeniable effects that have been seen as a direct result of the COVID-19 epidemic. Firstly, a look at where we left the UK podcast market prior to the pandemic. According to Midas's latest report, actually delivered yesterday, 10.1 million people in the UK now listen to podcasts each and every single week. We often refer to the podcast market as the fastest growing medium here in the UK. And to put this latest figure into context, that is no less than a 29% increase in unique listeners year on year. We also know that not only are more people listening than ever before, but they're actually listening for longer than ever before, with the average person consuming 7 hours worth of podcast content each and every week, a significant consumer-led commitment to any medium, I'm sure you'll agree. And when we also look at the demographic profiles of the UK podcast audience, we see that the gender split remains largely even. This result is undoubtedly driven by the wealth of diverse and quality content that is being released on a weekly and at times daily basis. However, another thing to note is the broadening of reach by age brackets. Long gone are the days when podcasts were only good for reaching a core 25 to 34 millennial male audience, as we have seen an influx of Gen Z listeners and those perhaps deemed slightly later adopters in the 45 plus audience. That being said, the value of this audience remains absolutely the same, as we see podcast listeners tending to be affluent, educated, influential, and far more likely to become early brand adopters. Now, when we consider how people are listening to their favorite podcast content, this is still heavily driven by mobile consumption, which plays to the requirement of an on-demand medium. They prefer to harness the increased streaming capabilities of mobile tariffs and Wi-Fi providers, salvaging precious memory space across their own devices. And 9 times out of 10, people will be listening via their favorite content in the captivating environment uniquely delivered via headphones. Finally, when we look at the current state of the consumption ecosystem, the UK is still dominated by Apple Podcasts, as we can see there at 61%, who are actually recently credited with having over 1 million individual podcasts readily available for podcast-hungry audiences. It's an incredible amount of content readily available. Now, with all of this being said, it's safe to say that the recent pandemic has had an undeniable effect on the media industry as a whole, and we have seen entire sectors of the industry severely impacted with regards to both audience consumption and, of course, advertising spends. However, when we consider the state of the podcast industry across the pandemic period to date specifically, these results are incredibly promising. Primarily, as you can see here, we saw a slight dip in listening figures across Monday to Friday for week commencing 16th of March. This was actually when, if you cast your minds back to when the UK government advised that businesses capable of doing so should work from home. So an understandable pause in your average consumer's habitual consumption patterns as they look to organise and assess their new look work routine. Not to mention the fact, of course, that our beloved Premier League indefinitely postponed all football matches, leading to a shift in content strategy for a wealth of football-related podcasters. However, it is the consumption pattern seen from week commencing 23rd of March, the week in which the UK first went into lockdown, that the true effect on the podcast industry can be seen. One of the notable highlights was actually delivered by our podcasters. As our content creators were able to take advantage of the agile nature of podcast production, we saw a trend against the curve in that week commencing 30th of March saw a record 3,330 episodes released in a single week. So an incredible feat by the content creators across the board. And this increase in content output was matched by an unquestionable thirst for podcast content amongst consumers. Evidence of this can be seen in the fact that March actually saw the term podcast being searched for more times than ever before, according to Google search data. So as we were saying, both this increase in content production and an evident hunger for podcast amongst consumers has undeniably helped in driving a remarkable 20% increase in listenership of Acast content since the rise of the pandemic. And I'm absolutely thrilled to report that the pinnacle of this growth to date has seen the delivery of an all-time record 11 million listens to Acast content in the last full week alone. Incredible, incredible stats and incredible growth, I'm sure you'll agree. Now, interestingly, we've also seen changes to the time of day at which the UK audience is consuming podcasts. Traditionally, we see spikes, as you can see here, in consumption during the morning and early evening, driven by people's need to find, well, escapism during their commutes, along with a later spike in the evening as people turn to their favourite podcasts as perhaps a companion whilst cooking dinner or simply to wind down. However, if we look at people's consumption habits for the last full week alone, what we are seeing is that people are listening for more sustained periods throughout the day. This, paired with the increases in listenership, clearly illustrate that although people's daily routines have been subject to change, their love for podcasts remain unconditional. Now, as mentioned, we at Acast have been tracking the movers and shakers within our content categories in order to deliver a view on the types of content trends we have been seeing during this pandemic. The following graph highlights some of the content categories in which we have seen the most significant growth, whilst also highlighting popular categories that may have seen little movement or perhaps even a slight decline. First to note is the huge increase in comedy listening across the pandemic. They say that laughter has healing properties, and we have certainly seen audiences flock to our comedy content whilst they seek a form of comedic escapism. One of the other major movers since the outbreak of the pandemic was our educational content. I have personally heard so many inspiring stories about people using the lockdown to upskill on a specific subject, whether that is to start learning a new language perhaps, or just simply brush up on an area of particular interest such as history or science. One thing is for sure is that self-improvement has definitely become a common theme. Others of note include listens to food and drink, lifestyle, and indeed health content, all understandably driven by consumers' want and need to feel better and live more. More on how you can do that yourselves in the next segment, thanks to Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. Then we move on to news and politics. It's an incredibly popular vertical with so many top premium publishers still releasing quality, informative content during the pandemic. I think the main takeaway from a slide like this here is that despite people's time being spent at home with the ability to simply flick over to a BBC News or a Sky News, for example, what we have seen is that people are actually staying loyal and leaning on their favourite publishers and their news content in order to stay abreast of current affairs. Finally, it's also important that we note the categories that have been affected in a different way by the pandemic. I mentioned earlier that sport content was undeniably hit by the postponement of the Premier League here in the UK, as I'm sure we all know. We actually saw listeners to our sport content drop by a total of 13% in week commencing 16th of March alone. However, what we can see below is a resilience and agility from our sport content creators in their ability to continue releasing content that feels current and lands with their audiences. This, as you can see, has led to only a 3% decrease in listeners to sport content across the pandemic period as listeners return to the category. So incredibly promising. And finally, a look at some of the spending trends we've seen across the pandemic to date. Below, you can see the top spending categories we have seen for March and April. When we consider the current limitations on people's free movement, it is probably unsurprising to see the bulk of recent investment coming from entertainment brands, as people look for effective ways to entertain not only themselves, but of course their families as well. We've also seen food and drink brands play a pivotal part in recent spending, as they look to inspire consumers to try a new recipe, an ingredient, or indeed a food delivery service. We have seen tech providers actively spending as people begin to consider how they can improve their home tech setup. And finally, and again, perhaps unsurprisingly, we've also seen consistent government spending across recent months, offering advice and direction as to how we can all play our part into protecting our NHS. Now, that, you may be pleased to know, concludes this section on podcast trends during a pandemic. I hope that you found the last 10 minutes or so interesting, if not useful. We're of course here to help support all of our friends across the industry. Should you require more information to help your planning strategies going forward, by all means, shoot any requests through to the email address you can see there. I look forward to catching up with you all in due course. But in the meantime, it is my pleasure to pass over to our Vice President of Brand, Lizzie Pollett, who is joined by the brilliant Dr. Rangan Chatterjee.
Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Lizzie. I am VP of Brand at Acast, as Josh says. So I actually have the easy job this morning because I just get to have a lovely chat with Rangan, one of our top podcasters. So for those that don't know, Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, he is one of the most recognizable doctors in the country. He is an author, he is a television presenter, and of course, he is a podcaster. So before we talk to him, let's just hear a quick clip of Feel Better, Live More. Roll VT.
Hi, my name is Rangan Chatterjee, GP, television presenter and author of the best-selling books The Stress Solution and The 4-Pillar Plan. I believe that all of us have the ability to feel better than we currently do, but getting healthy has become far too complicated. With this podcast, I aim to simplify it. I'm going to be having conversations with some of the most interesting and exciting people both within as well as outside the health space to hopefully inspire you as well as empower you with simple tips that you can put into practice immediately to transform the way that you feel. I believe that when we are healthier, we are happier, because when we feel better, we live more.
Here he is. Dr. Rangan, are you on the line?
I am, Lizzie. I put my video here as well. Can you guys see me at all?
Yes, I think we can all see you.
I can't. Oh, there we go. I can now. Brilliant. Fantastic.
If you can't, I'm sure. Yeah, everyone says we can hear you. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've literally just hot-footed it from talking to the BBC. Is that right?
Yeah, I was on BBC One on Daily Kitchen Live for the last 40 minutes. So just jumped from that onto this call. So getting quite used to the whole Zoom, Zoom landscape, as everyone is, I think.
I know. Well, I've got my fancy background. Don't be jealous, anyone. So yeah, we heard a clip of your podcast, obviously, but why don't you tell everyone in your own words, what the show's about, why you started it, etc.
Yeah, so I started it maybe just over 2 years ago, just before my first book was coming out. I'd had a few BBC shows before. Podcasting, I sort of consumed podcasting a lot. And I actually thought, okay, and I spoke to Penguin about maybe launching a podcast around the time of my first book to just communicate directly with my audience. It might help the promotion and PR around my book. That was really the thinking behind it. But I've got to be honest, I started off with 6 episodes. I thought I'm going to put 6 out there and see what happens. And frankly, it's become the mainstay of what I do. I absolutely love podcasting. It has allowed me to grow a team around what I do, which is really trying to empower every single person I come across, whether it's a patient, whether it's a listener, whether it's someone on TV who watches me. I want to empower everyone to be the architect of their own health, to believe that they have got their health under their control. And I've really evolved, Lizzie, over the last 2 years. I've really found my voice. And I've got to say, I know it's now one of the biggest health podcasts in not only the UK, but in Europe as well, which is just incredible. And I love it. And I think one of the reasons why my audience is really enjoying it and why it's growing week on week is because I think people are really enjoying unedited content. And this, when I say unedited, I mean, when I do a BBC show, it goes through BBC editorial and, it all has to tick certain boxes. In a podcast, I can talk to whoever I want about whatever I want. And I really think people really like that authenticity. And, I'm very lucky. Lots of high profile people listen. Chris Evans for a few months this year was raving about my podcast every day, saying it's his and his wife's favorite show. That clearly impacts listenership. If someone as influential as Chris talks about it regularly, more people listen. And so, yeah, I could talk to you forever about my podcast because I love it. But I'd never miss a Wednesday. And sometimes during the pandemic, I've been putting out 2 a week. But I always stick to that Wednesday 1 p.m. release, as I have done for the last 2 years.
Yeah, actually, that's something I wanted to ask you about, because obviously you are better placed than most in our current situation, coming from a medical background. So how has that sort of affected the podcast or the types of content that you're putting out, or, how you interact with your listeners? Has it changed over the last few weeks, would you say?
Yeah, so look, I've sort of experimented a little bit, and that's the great thing about podcasts. You can experiment. I certainly feel that I've built up loyalty over 2.5 years, where if I try a couple of things and they don't land, I think my audience are going to stay with me. But, the good news is they have landed every time, actually. So I've done a bit of pandemic-related content. I'm a doctor. This is the biggest health story of my entire life. So I feel I need to help people manage their anxiety, manage their stress, which they're responding really well to. In fact, I'd probably say the episode in the last few weeks that has had the most listeners on my podcast is the one I did specifically on how to manage anxiety in the face of a global pandemic, and people have absolutely loved it. So I've had to experiment. I'm sometimes releasing 2 a week. I'm going to maybe put out some shorter content. Like I have a big long form conversation every Wednesday. That's the sort of bread and butter of my podcast. But I think I'm going to experiment with some shorter ones, maybe on a Friday, maybe on a Sunday, to just see what the audience want. Because you guys showed some graphs before how listenership has changed. And I'm trying to respond to that a little bit as well, because I appreciate that not everyone has their long commutes anymore, where they used to sit on the tube or a train and actually remove themselves from the tedium of life by listening to a podcast. And so a lot of people are listening to my show, I know, on their 1 hour daily walk when they go out once a day to get their exercise. They're also listening to the show. So does that answer your question, Lizzie?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I actually really enjoyed this week's episode. It's Kelly, isn't it, from Stanford University? And I think that was really helpful, because it just reminded me how important movement is, particularly at a time like this, because, movement isn't just about being fit and healthy. It's also about the effect on the mind. So I thought that chat was really interesting. And I think, the more content that we can help listeners have to help them through these strange times, the better, for sure.
Yeah, and I feel a real responsibility to do that. I feel that people are anxious, they are struggling. But the reality is that there is so much that we can all do that doesn't take long each day, that will absolutely transform the way that we feel. And, I'm trying my best. My podcast has always been about actionable tips. So I think that's where the reputation has come from. I have I've been a doctor for almost 20 years, so I've got a huge amount of experience. And then as an expert generalist, I talk to a huge variety of different people. Sometimes they're health experts, sometimes they're celebrities with exciting stories, sometimes it's someone unknown. Like another big one recently for me was when I spoke to an ex-prisoner, John McAvoy. One of the most incredible conversations I've had. He was in isolation for 12 months, where he didn't leave his prison cell for an entire year. And so it was like, well, what can we learn? How did he cope with that? Because all of us are experiencing isolation on some level compared to our previous lives. And I think it's that variety, Lizzie, that is, I think that's been a big part of my podcast success, is that it's different each week, but there's still a common theme. And I think that's what people really like.
Absolutely. So it would be remiss of me to not talk about, your work with brands around the podcast. So on the webinar, we have lots of existing or potential brand advertisers. So just in terms of, I'm always struck with your sponsor reads, for example, how you managed to nail them so naturally. So, part of what we really push is that the importance of podcast advertising is that it does sit alongside the content and it feels authentic. And I think you really managed to do that, whether you're working with, the likes of The Economist or Microsoft. What's your sort of approach to those sponsor messages and the ads and the reads, etc.? Do you have a method, or do you just go for it?
Yeah, so I think every podcast host is different, right? And I really appreciate you saying that, Lizzie. A lot of people have commented to me, other podcast hosts as well, saying, look, God, I really wish I could deliver those sort of authentic reads like you're doing. And I don't think there's anything special to it. I think we just have to be ourselves. The podcast listener relationship is very intimate. People are very, very connected. There's real depth there. I noticed that more than even my social media channels, my books, going on TV. That listenership you get with your podcast, with your podcast listeners, is completely different, because people are allowing you into their lives. They're off for a walk, or they're off lying in bed or sitting on the sofa and just chilling, and they've got their earbuds on. So you literally become all-encompassing. And the goal with my podcast is to make it feel as though you're eavesdropping on a private conversation that I'm having. I really want that intimacy. And therefore, if you think about, if I have a sponsor, if I then go and do a really kind of, TV sort of stereotypical type sponsor read, it just wouldn't work. And I think the reason I show such high conversion rates for brands and really good ROI is because it is authentic. And one thing I will say is I really think brands need to trust the podcast host, because the host knows their audience really well. And it's much better if it's delivered in the sort of style of that host. So because my podcast is relaxed and informal, my sponsor reads are relaxed and informal. And I really enjoy them, actually. And I will say, for me as a doctor, I'm very, very particular, because like my audience, the reason the podcast is so popular is because people respect me. They think I'm authentic in what I say. So I also am very careful with the messaging, because if you push it too hard, I just think it doesn't fit with what they're expecting from me. So I think it's up to each podcast host to have that conversation with the brand and say, look, please trust me, this is how my audience are going to respond well. So certainly that would be my take on it, Lizzie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's when the perfect scenario for us is when we have a podcaster like you, who knows exactly how to deliver that perfectly. We have a client who is flexible and really invests in podcasting and understands that, it's about the podcaster really taking their message in their own way rather than trying to be too controlling. So that's why I think we've had so much success, particularly with you, I suppose.
And Lizzie, I will say Acast give guidance for about 1 minute for a read. And I think that's brilliant guidance, because sometimes in the past, I've tried to put all the key points that are on a brief, and sometimes you end up talking for 90 seconds, 100 seconds. And I just don't feel those convert as well as when, you go, okay, we're going to make this 60 seconds. What are the key points? What are sort of 3 or 4 of the key points from that brief of 10 points that we want to get across? And so that's something I've certainly learned from Acast, is that, don't go on for too long. You can always say more things and more information, but I think you run the risk of people switching off unless it's really targeted and to the point.
No, absolutely. You're right. We haven't got long left. And there's something I really actually personally want to ask you. Are you gutted that you're not actually going to be running the London Marathon this weekend after you were unbeknownly signed up to it in January by Chris Evans?
Yeah, well, you know what? It's a double-edged sword that, yes, Chris sprung it on me in the studio at the end of a brilliant conversation, which was meant to be about my book. But I will say he spent the first half of it not talking about the book, just talking about my podcast, which sent it straight to #1 on all podcasts in the UK for the next week. And then he sprung this marathon on me. Look, I have mixed feelings. I was really looking forward to the challenge. I hope it goes ahead in October. And I've actually, I'm trying to train as much as possible. It's, like everyone, I'm facing difficulties with work, having my kids at home the whole time. But I'm looking forward to seeing it on October. And I've actually had an idea to do some specific marathon content on my show around that. I might team up with Chris and the team there as well, potentially around that. So again, looking forward to doing it personally. But again, I think there's opportunity there for the podcast as well to reflect that.
Great. Well, yeah, I hope it goes ahead in October, and we look forward to seeing your progress. And yeah, it would be great to have some marathon specials, I think, on the podcast, for sure. I'd definitely listen to those. So sadly, we're going to have to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rangan.
No worries.
Yeah, and then if people have got follow-up questions, you can get in touch and we can always put them to you. Introducing Leo, one of our key account directors in the UK, who's going to talk a bit more about Marketplace.
Hi everyone, sorry I'm now playing second fiddle to Rangan, which is a gig I'd never want to be up against. Rangan and I actually joined Acast at a similar time and worked on one of the campaigns that I'm most proud of, which was for Unilever's Zendium, where we managed to get Rangan, obviously a doctor, a practicing doctor, and Dr. Stephen Lin, a dentist, to talk about Unilever's toothpaste brand. And it's still made for a great listen, which what other medium can you do that in? So I'm Leo. I'm going to take you through a brief snapshot of Acast Marketplace and why we launched it. Firstly, I'd like everyone just to take a second and think about what self-isolation would have been like 20 years ago. There would have been no podcasts, no Acast, no Netflix, no Zoom. In fact, the smartphone had not even been invented. Just for a terrifying second, imagine struggling through isolation with just Midsummer Murders and Antiques Roadshow for entertainment, just hours and hours of David Dickinson. We are very fortunate these days. We have so much more choice to decide when, how, where we consume our media. And advertisers also benefit. We have so many more options to decide how and when they reach people. This evolution gives advertisers new opportunities to align products and messaging to actions. There is still one show I'd watch though, and that's Blind Date. Good old Scylla, there she is. She was a true legend. And what I wouldn't give to bring her back. At Acast, we often daydream about all the podcasts we miss out on. Imagine how epic a weekly roundup from Graham and Scylla would have been. Most of the millennials and Gen Xers on the line will remember gathering around a TV on Saturday nights with the family, watching Blind Date, and then always Gladiators. I'd ask you all to really think about how much things have changed since then. In order to watch Blind Date, we had to be there on the right day, at the right time, and on the right channel. Fundamentally, we had to live to the schedule of the broadcasters. But thankfully, that is now a thing of the past. So what does this mean for brands? It means they can reach people when they're out running, when they are relaxing, and at every other single moment in their day. We have podcasts that help people get up in the morning. We have podcasts that help people go to sleep at night. So the opportunities we can offer brands are as limitless as the activities consumers can cram into their days. Podcast smart home device use is growing really quickly during isolation, as you'd expect, with Alexa listening up 26%, but the majority of our reach is still to mobile devices. So when our listeners are at home isolating, our advertisers are right there with them. The amount of choice available to consumers has changed too. It's no longer normal to get all of your news and your sport and your opinion from one newspaper each morning. We now have the free choice to go and get our political news from the BBC, our opinions from Twitter, or our sport content from our favorite sports journalist podcast. We have even seen over 30 coronavirus-related podcasts spring up during this pandemic, showing the agility of podcasting as a medium. This presents a perfect opportunity to target consumers contextually. We can connect sports brands with people engaging in sport and parenting brands with parenting content, which we believe paves the way for a more natural and relevant dialogue between the brand and the consumer. Lastly, consumers are increasingly able to choose to pay for ad-free services. One of my colleagues, Seema, joked earlier that she had completed Netflix during isolation. And I'll tell you right now, she's not the only one. There are a massive amount of consumers using Netflix and Spotify who are just not seeing or hearing many adverts at all. That means when you do reach these people, it's more meaningful and the messaging recall is higher. The podcast audience is exactly like that. It's so valuable because it's so hard to reach in exactly the same way. Our Acast Intelligence data shows that nearly a third of our listeners are using a display ad blocker. 84% are using premium audio services, and 62%, although they love audio, are not listening to any commercial radio at all. The fact that our listeners love a premium audio experience with high quality content is clearly evidenced then by the fact that 76% of our audience listen to the BBC radio. That means if your brand is advertising online, in display, on radio, in digital music, there is still a really good chance you haven't reached a podcast audience at all. And why else are our listeners hard to reach? Because they have really high standards for audio. They like low ad environments. They like listening to premium audio via headphones. And most of all, they love our talented podcasters. Podcasting has made it possible with just one touch of a button to be transported onto an Adam Buxton dog walk, or invite ourselves to a dinner party with Jessie Ware and her mum, who just so happened to be entertaining Sadiq Khan, Nigella Lawson, Ed Sheeran. Podcasting has given the world a new level of talent access that just wasn't possible before, unless you knew them, of course. And I haven't had an invite from Jessie Ware to dinner yet. To give you an idea of the bond between listener and podcaster, back to Jessie. Her live event podcast sold out in just 14 minutes earlier in the year. That is a Glastonbury level of excitement and fan devotion that perfectly showcases how powerful that listener-podcaster relationship has become. Podcasts have given talent a new platform to get their brand and their personality out to their audience in a way that just wasn't possible before. And that means they can speak to their fans in different ways and endorse, elevate, and validate your brand with their own reputation. Podcast advertising gives your brand the opportunity to leverage that new relationship and to benefit from the halo effect of a talent endorsement in a trusted environment. Alongside this, each show will bring your commercial messaging to life with not only their own unique style, but also all of the things they know about their audience. Expect hilarity from off menu and spellbinding sincerity from the intelligence. Speaking of the intelligence, Acast is the global and UK market leader in podcast content, and that is driven by our publishers. This slide just shows you a snapshot of our incredible broadcast scale. To give you a sense of the scale that we have here, if you look at the top 5 logos from The Guardian across to The Times on this slide, those publishers combined provide nearly 1,000 podcasts alone. These famous publishers are investing in the space all the time and producing some of the world's biggest and best shows every day. The Guardian's release of Today in Focus in late 2018 began a movement of daily podcasts in the UK. Really high quality journalist curated shows delivering content direct to people's homes and phones each morning. Since then, we've seen the launch of more daily shows, News Briefing from the FT, The Economist's Intelligence, The Football Ramble Daily, and the exciting new Stories of Our Times from The Times. Make no mistake, these brilliant UK-based shows are some of the biggest podcasts in the world. We were recently described as an audio influencer talent agency in the press, and it's not too far off. This slide shows a tiny snapshot of all the talented podcasters who make our medium so special and varied today. There is genuinely something for everyone, whether it's the multi-award winning Griefcast, the fascinating Immaculate Deception, or our incredible roster of shows like Dear Joan and Jericha, Off Menu, Shagged, Married, Annoyed, My Dad Wrote a Porno, these shows that make Acast the home of British podcast comedy. All these shows are exclusive to Acast, and podcasting in the UK would be nothing without the amazing contributors showcased in this slide who provide such a wealth of incredible content and advertising opportunity. I'd also like to remind you that podcasting is not all about the biggest names. We have thousands upon thousands of small, brilliant independent shows with incredibly loyal audiences, such as the weird and wonderful running commentary, where the podcasters actually run whilst recording their show, providing hours of breathy entertainment for their 7,000 and growing weekly listeners. What could be better for a sports brand? Acast is also fully platform agnostic. Our content is available on all apps and devices, every mobile phone. It's on Google Home, Alexa, Apple Watches, in-car apps, and every podcast platform from Apple to Deezer to Spotify to Acast. So whether listeners are out exercising or in the kitchen cooking with their smart home device, if they are listening to Acast content, regardless of the platform, they are listening to dynamically inserted Acast commercial messaging. Acast Marketplace has 3 distinct opportunities: ads, sponsorship, and branded content. Ads are typically 30-second long commercial messages dynamically inserted into show content. We can use ads to target contextual verticals such as news and politics, or demographical verticals like millennials. I'm sure we've all seen the Google announcement. They're going to be dispensing with cookies in just 2 years. So as consumers become more anonymized, contextual advertising will become more and more effective and necessary than ever. And we're really looking forward to a future of brands putting context first. In terms of sponsorship, this is the bread and butter of podcast advertising. Typically around 1 minute long, our podcast will bring your brand to life, combining their creative genius with your commercial messaging in a spoken, authentic endorsement. Our shows use their knowledge of their audience to offer your brand an authentic and relatable endorsement in a manner reflective of their show style. Lastly, branded content. This could be anything from a branded episode to a brand new series, to a live tour, or even a podcast recorded whilst climbing Mount Everest. Your imagination is the only limit in this section, and I'll hand over to our very own creative genius, Jack, to tell you more.
So far, we've heard from one of the UK's most successful podcasters. We have heard some really interesting trends around the impact of the pandemic on listener habits and listening numbers. What I would now like to shift the focus on is content and creative. So I head up the creative team here in the UK, and constantly we're being asked by brands, how is this affecting what we're doing? What is our capacity to get new advertising creative out there? So we've got some really interesting trends to go through. But first of all, let's start with the content. So what have our podcasters been up to? We just heard from Dr. Rangan, and obviously he's slightly adjusting what he's doing, put out more content in response to the current situation. But it's not just him, there's a whole host of content creators who are doing things slightly differently. As we know, podcasting hasn't been as affected compared to some mediums by the current pandemic, but that's not to say that there hasn't been a need for some sort of change. As we know, podcasting is the home of spoken word, it's the home of great conversations. Those conversations tend to happen face-to-face, either in a studio or on location. So how have people adapted to this? We're going to look at 3 key trends here that I think are really ruling the roost at the moment. The first of which is new formats. So obviously, lots of podcasts have very familiar formats that we'll all know and love. They've had to change those in order to get the episodes out. The podcasters haven't wanted to be silenced, and they've had to work out different ways to weave in guests. A great example of this is Jay Rayner's show. I'm sure many of you will know this as Out for Lunch with Jay Rayner. It's just returned as In for Lunch with Jay Rayner. He's still going to be sharing a plate of food, a glass of wine, a conversation with a celebrity guest each week. They'll just be doing so from the comfort of their own home. So there's loads of smart little twists like that that are allowing podcasters to keep releasing content. Secondly, live podcasting. Now, this isn't anything new. We've probably all seen a live podcast, either in person or in line. But in my opinion, live podcasting has finally found its feet in the last month, especially when it comes to live streaming. The draw for many people with podcasting has always been that it's on-demand content. You can consume it on the go, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. The wherever for many people now, for the foreseeable future, is sadly the comfort of our own homes. That means those shareable moments, that appointment to view content suddenly seems a lot more relevant than it once was. So we're seeing big shows such as Off Menu, who did a great lockdown live stream with Richard Herring the other week, go live for the first time to great effect to rack up big numbers. So that's definitely something we didn't imagine happening at the start of the year, but it's a real big trend. And lastly, communities. Lots of podcasts will have huge organic communities surrounding them of dedicated listeners. That's something which has been in place for a while, but they're currently evolving in a really interesting way at the moment. So from book clubs to cookery clubs to, in the case of Films to Be Buried With, an isolation film club where Brett Goldstein and his listeners watch a film together over the course of the week, talk about it on social, and then that's reflected in that week's episode. So lots of interesting changes happening to content, and there's some real interesting opportunities out there as a result. But what does this mean for creative? Where do the advertisers fit in? While the content has seen a few changes take place, I'd say the main headline for the creative and for advertisers is one of constants. If we've learned anything over this last half hour or so, you have to be agile and nimble to work in the podcast industry. Whether you're a creator or an advertiser, things get thrown at you, you need to be adaptable. And that's exactly what we're able to do for our advertisers. So if we look at the 3 creative routes that Leo flagged earlier, we can see there are many constants at play, which is a great thing. So first off, ads. We still have a 24-hour turnaround period for ads. The production process, the sound quality, the timelines remain completely intact. If we look at sponsor reads, it's again the same story. As Rangan was just illustrating, he set up to record from home. He can do those beautiful sponsor reads now, the same as he could do at the start of the year. So again, sponsor read, timelines, production values, the same story. And lastly, branded content, the bit that we get most excited about in the creative team. So when we create a piece of branded content, it's an opportunity for a brand to engage with the listener through long form content in a way like no other. The average listening time to a piece of branded content hosted by Acast last year was 28 minutes. That's an insane level of engagement, and we're still able to offer that exact same service thanks to advanced remote recording techniques as previously. And we're creating branded content for companies across all sectors, all industries, and we're able to do that the exact same as before. And we have a really nice live example of that coming up shortly. You can see exactly how we're doing it and what the end result is. So that's the creative, those are the content. While there has been lots of constants for advertisers, there are also some new opportunities, and these fall within both existing content and new content. With existing content, there is a hell of a lot of evergreen podcast content out there. We've seen lots of different media platforms bubble up evergreen stuff recently, from HBO Go to Netflix to BBC iPlayer. Everybody's wanting that best-in-class evergreen content. We see posts on social every day from people asking for the next great binge-worthy watch or listen, or can anybody recommend good comedy podcasts? As we saw, they're really popular at the moment. So if you're a brand and you know that your target demographic listeners are searching for this content at the moment, why not package it up, get some talent to endorse it for them and you, and serve it to a listener base? So here are some examples of how that could work. First of all, self-improvement content. Why not give a listener a dose of self-improvement through something like Coffee Break Spanish or Control-Alt-Delete? Or how about health and wellness? We know people are very on top of their mental health and well-being at this moment in time, so why not work with Dr. Rangan, Power Hour, Doctor's Kitchen to serve that up? Or maybe it's a dose of escapism you'd like to give somebody. There's no better way to do that through a timeless comedy collection. Award winners such as Private Parts, My Dad Wrote a Porno, Adam Buxton, so much great comedy content out there. And lastly, comforting voices. We all would like some comfort at this moment in time, and there's no better people to do that than the likes of Dan Snow, Jessie Ware, David Tennant, Scroobius Pip. So many great comforting voices we can offer brands. So if you're wanting to serve that to people, we can easily package that up and make it happen with the endorsement of the talent. So that's existing content. But if we take a look at the new content creation opportunities, this I think is where podcasting is really coming into its own at the moment. We're having countless conversations with brands at the moment who have had to cancel a video shoot or a live event over the coming weeks for obvious reasons. Rather than letting that brand ambassador go to waste, that talent that would have featured in that activation or on that video, why not bring them to us and plug them into a podcast? We have over 10,000 shows that we represent, and they're as broad or as niche as you like. And it's very easy for us to find you one that works, whoever you are, whatever story you want to tell, whatever target demographic you want to get in touch with, we can easily plug that brand ambassador and find a home for it within one of our podcasts. And that could be long form or short form. There's so many ways to cut that. So those are the opportunities. Those are the trends. And what I'm going to do now is just press pause on the pandemic patter for a couple minutes and ask everybody to do me a favor. Could you please don your headphones? So when we usually do these Sound Smart events, as Georgie said, they're in person, and we truly love to all be in the room with you right now. However, the one benefit of this unique dynamic is that we can actually showcase the power of 3D audio. There was a slide right at the start when Josh was presenting, and you may have noticed that it detailed the fact that over 90% of people listen to 3D or listen to podcasting through headphones, which means it's one of the only mediums that you can truly showcase the power of 3D audio. Why do we talk about 3D audio? Why do we think it's important? Because we know that it works. There's a really great piece of research conducted by Neuro Insights last year, and they compared the impact of 3D audio ads versus regular stereo ads. Not only were 3D audio ads 36% more memorable, but the emotional response they invoked was 39% higher. So if you do it right, it can really work. So what you're about to hear now is 90 seconds of best-in-class 3D ads, audio, hopefully some thought starters that will be relevant for the clients that you work with. And after that, the next voice you hear will be the dulcet tones of Christiana from our sales team, who can take you through some best-in-class creative case studies. But for now, thank you very much. Enjoy the audio, and in the words of Cilla Black, ta-ra.
Sound. It's everywhere. No, literally. It's here. And here. Over here. The growth in podcast listening means more of us than ever are listening via headphones. In fact, 90% of us. And that means we have your undivided attention.
Where did you go? I should know, but it's cold and I don't.
Whether you're listening to some new music
Show me the way.
or your favourite podcast,
Take them all on with BT Sport, even if you don't have BT Broadband. Search BT Sport.
And she's come back, having saved 3 match points. And Venus Williams rolls on in Miami.
with 3D audio, we can take you anywhere. From the peace and quiet of your own desert island to the electric atmosphere of the racecourse. 3D audio can put you in the middle of the movies.
On the crime-filled streets of Gotham City.
And even to the edge of space. Some people would do anything to promote their new book. Isn't that right, British astronaut Tim Peake?
Hi, I'm Tim Peake.
I know. I just introduced you. Immerse your listeners in the sound of your brand with 3D audio.
I hope you enjoyed that audio. As Jack mentioned, my name's Christiana Brenton. I'm one of our key account directors here in the UK, despite the perhaps misleading accent. As mentioned, I now have the pleasure of taking you through some of our market-leading work that really helps demonstrate the potential within podcasts and the kind of creative innovation we've spoken about today. And on that note, I'm very pleased to share a case study from our recent John Lewis and Partners Christmas partnership. And I believe we may also even have our lovely agency partners on the line, Manning Gottlieb. So a very personal hello and thank you for joining. So this was John Lewis and Partners' first ever podcast partnership as part of their annual Christmas campaign in a bid to further diversify the channel mix beyond their infamous small screen advert. They challenged us to develop a cross-category pan-partnership campaign, meaning we had to include John Lewis and Partners, multiple categories within, and then also nod to Waitrose and Partners, sometimes within the exact same script execution, so no easy feat. This was to reach and engage a new, younger audience and to help shift brand perceptions and reposition John Lewis and Partners as a modern retailer. The opportunity was 4 key Christmas moments that underpin each annual campaign. First, we have fashion party wear, decorating the tree, hosting and feasting, and finally, last-minute gifting. The execution saw John Lewis partner with 4 of the UK's leading podcast influencers to produce a series of unique content spanning show sponsorships, branded segments, branded episodes, and a media-first live in-store podcast recording. Firstly, we had our always-on layer with each of our hosts creating unique sponsor reads, sharing their own personal Christmas rituals with their listeners as they relate to each key theme. Then we had our first branded segment with my very favourite podcast, Jessie Ware's Table Manners. Here, Jessie and her mum Lenny shared their experience from attending an in-store personal styling service, selecting dresses for the party season. Highly recommend you tune in. This was season 8, episode 6 with Luke Evans. And before I move on, if, like me, you're potentially in isolation, away from home in lockdown, I highly recommend you tune into Table Manners because you'll find Jessie's mum's voice, Lenny, very soothing, maternal. Anyway, back to the case study. Next, we had a collaboration with, yet again, Table Manners, this time an entire branded episode of evergreen content, bringing to life the hosting and feasting theme with a full Christmas menu of Waitrose products and the table set with beautiful John Lewis serveware integrated into the episode as they shared a meal with the guest, Nicole Scherzinger, who, I may add, said that the Waitrose turkey was the best she's ever tasted in her whole life. Finally, we had a live in-store recording with Private Parts, who integrated a social mechanic encouraging their audience to nominate someone special they'd like Jamie and Francis to personally select a gift for. Now, before I get to some of the results, I'd just like to play some of the content highlights from the campaign. So please, headphones are back on for best listener experience.
Hello everybody, advertising Santa here. I'm glad 'cause we're approaching my favourite time of year. I know some people hate it, but I just think it's great 'cause I can finally get my baubles out and start to decorate.
We had a lovely stylist called Adrian.
I actually fell in love with Adrian. Yeah. He was my new right-hand person. And he found things that I wouldn't have even looked at that really suited me and fitted me well and made me feel like $1 million.
A nut roast, that sounds fun. Mum, you've made a bit of an effort today. You've got your John Lewis beaded placemats, you've got your baubles out.
I always like my baubles out, darling.
Oh my God, these are the cutest thing I've ever seen.
I know you like treats. This is called the Wonder Experience in John
This
Lewis.
is sounding very dodgy.
Yeah, so come through this door. Here we go. Wonder, Francis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Look,
Wow.
Hi, hey.
Oh my
There's
God.
your own tin with Jamie Street.
Oh wait, hang on.
God.
Are you Katie?
So normally I can see you all and the live reactions, but I hope you were smiling like me. So the average listen through rate for all 3 pieces of branded content produced for this partnership was an incredible 39 minutes, or 40% higher than our 2019 internal average. Results that also earned this particular partnership a shortlist nomination for Campaign Media Awards Best Branded Content Execution. But not only did this partnership generate long-form consumer engagement, podcasts were also able to deliver on both key brand metrics and hard business results. Together, we achieved a 13% increase in John Lewis & Partners ad recall amongst those exposed for sponsorship, an 18% uplift for the statement, John Lewis & Partners is a brand I love, and notably, 67% of audiences either directly visited a store or the website after hearing the ad campaign. An incredible result, particularly in the era of unprecedented retail competition, online giants, and such a cluttered Christmas marketplace. And while, of course, this case study does reflect a pre-COVID-19 world, as you've just heard from Jack, this type of creativity is absolutely still possible, thanks to the nature of remote recording and advances in technology. Sponsorees and branded content with multiple guests in different locations are easily recorded from the safety of homes, with multiple partnerships conceived, created and launched during the last 4-week period. We actually have a recording next week that includes multiple people, 2 hosts, and then 2 different guests in different locations, and we're able to generate the branded content through mics and remote software. And of course, as we've seen, live in-store recordings, like the John Lewis & Partners example, simply become live stream virtual communities and another welcome outlet for people to entertain themselves during isolation. We're in such a fortunate and unique position to continue to deliver innovative campaigns and fresh content throughout this new world. And on that note, I'd like to give you back to our sales director, Josh Woodhouse, to close with some of our current opportunities. And thanks again for your time. Look forward to seeing you all in the flesh post-lockdown. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you very much, Christiana. So we've taken a deep dive into what the podcasting landscape looks like during a pandemic. We have gained a fascinating insight into the current climate from the eyes of a podcaster. Thanks again to Dr. Chatterjee for that. We've heard Leo and Jack talk up all of the brilliant activation opportunities available. And finally, thanks to Christiana and an incredibly excited Nicole Scherzinger, we have just heard about a best-in-class example to get everybody's creative juices flowing. But before I hand over to Georgie to bring our session to an end, I want to spend a few minutes just highlighting some current opportunities available for activation immediately for you and your brands. And we begin with a spin on some old favorites. First up is Mr. David Tennant, as he does a podcast with. One of the UK's biggest podcasts is back and with a season recorded under lockdown. David will be chatting through video call, of course, with some of the world's biggest stars from TV, movies and entertainment. Series 1 guests included Olivia Colman, Sarah Ian McKellen, and James Corden. And we can expect more of the same for this series. As you can imagine, David delivers the most superb sponsorship reads, a voice like velvet. And there is still plenty of time to get involved for the upcoming series. So do get in touch. Next, we have In for Lunch with Jay Rayner, previously mentioned by JP. So Jay Rayner is back with his popular celebrity food podcast, but with a very quick temporary rebrand. Rather than choosing a restaurant in which to visit, Jay arranges for a meal to be delivered to our guests' houses before joining them for the same meal and a good old chat. Confirmed guests include Russell Tovey, George Ezra, Dita Von Teese, and even Edgar Wright. It's my absolute pleasure to announce some new members to the Acast family. We begin by announcing one of the largest comedy podcasts in the UK in Shagged, Married, Annoyed, a personal favourite of mine. In this show, Chris and Rosie Ramsey will be chatting all about life, relationships, arguments, annoyances, parenting, growing up, and everything in between. Each week, they'll answer questions from both the public and a secret celebrity. This is an incredibly fantastic and a hilarious show. So if you haven't already, please do check it out. The next one is another I'm definitely excited for. This is a fangirl moment for me, I cannot lie. Is called Grounded with Louis Theroux. Of course, being a BBC product, we will only be monetizing this outside of the UK. So if there are any international clients on board, do let us know. But we are absolutely thrilled to have Louis on board with a brand new show. In this podcast specifically, we join Louis as he uses the lockdown to track down some high-profile people he's been looking to talk to. A fascinating mix of the celebrated, but of course the controversial and perhaps the mysterious. And finally, we have Growing Up with Galdem, hosted by Galdem's founder, Liv Little, and head of editorial, Charlie Brinkhurst-Cuff. This is the first podcast to come from the media company that was founded in 2015. Inspired by stories of growing up as people of colour, each week sees special guests invited to respond to old diary entries, letters, or even text messages from their younger selves. This show focuses on nurturing important discussions about growing up and is absolutely perfect when looking to reach that core Gen Z audience that we mentioned earlier in this presentation. And that's it, guys. That includes this final section of today's Sound Smart event from me. I will now pass back over to our managing director and true podcat, Georgie Holt.
Thanks so much, Josh, and well done, team. You did a fantastic job. You are all now officially 1 hour and 1 minute closer to getting out of lockdown. So thank you so much for joining us today. The impact of the pandemic, the impact that it's had on podcasting has shown that the medium is demonstrating more agility, creativity, and confidence than ever before. We're seeing the highest listener figures ever, with more and more new exciting podcast content being created. Creators are in turn responding to the limits that lockdown has placed on all of us with innovative new shows and formats. Throughout it all, Acast has continued to deliver outstanding work for advertisers, delivering meaningful connections with audience during times of uncertainty. To follow up, there will be a one-pager provided after this session, which covers the stats you all heard today. This presentation has also been recorded as a podcast, of course, and will be shared with you in due course. We will also share the 3D audio experience with you all too. If you have any further questions, or if you'd like us to host a bespoke immersion session for you and your team on how you can work with us, please do get in touch with those emails below. And that is it. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care, stay well, and I hope to see you all soon.